Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, Twitch sounds good. I think YouTube's good too. I got a tweet. Where's my tweet? There it is. Atlanta FaZe claim their second championship of the season. We're live. The Ego episode. Countdown. Stop by YouTube or Twitch. Bang. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 162 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking CDL Major 2. Just a few hours ago, Atlanta FaZe claimed their second major championship of the season, and we have a lot more to talk about, but that'll be the top line. And before we get into any of the major stuff, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Like you said, a lot of juicy stuff to talk about as we anticipated. It was a pretty exciting major, second event in a row where we didn't necessarily predict the exact outcome of the first day of matches, but we correctly predicted that something unexpected was going to happen. And we'll be talking about that later. But overall, it was a pretty exciting event. A lot of the usual characters so far this season were, uh, competing on this championship Sunday just a couple hours ago. Some other, interesting tidbits here and there that we'll throw in. But yeah, I'm going to stop yapping and pass it back to you.
Unlike Major 1, I think it's fair to say that Major 2 ended with a whimper, not a bang. Major 1, that was one of the closest grand final series. And this time around, FaZe, who had beaten the Vancouver Surge 3-2 in the winners finals. I believe that was the only Game 5 of the entire weekend, was that winners finals that FaZe won. And then we get to the grand finals. Vancouver beat Toronto to get into the grand finals, and FaZe really dominated. Like, I'm sure there were some close calls, in some of these maps where they may be a little closer than the final score indicated. But this was a 4-0 grand final sweep for FaZe, which is incredibly surprising, especially considering Vancouver had been kind of, at least coming into this major, the kryptonite to FaZe, at least if that existed, I guess. But we saw online that Vancouver hadn't beaten FaZe not once but twice. They were the only teams since I believe like December that had been able to beat FaZe. And I think there's good reason to believe that they were going to do that again, because they did look very strong even earlier in this tournament. But in the grand finals, it was all FaZe. A lot of talk from Atlanta, Celium following 0-4 down the tunnel to continue to talk trash, which was amazing. And I think this is at least a personal opinion, but I think this championship is a real legacy builder for Atlanta FaZe. They have had this reputation, I think unearned really, but they've had this reputation over the last few years that they're choking in the grand finals. They can't get it done. They can't get over the hump. They're silver surfers in a way, I guess. But they haven't performed up to standard when they get in these big moments. But now they have two major championships this season. LA Thieves, who I think we both believed would be in the grand finals or certainly in contention, down to the wire for Major 2. They flamed out. They had two mess ups really. They just didn't come to play. FaZe never looked like that. They had the struggles with Vancouver, but they end up winning this and claiming their second major title of the season. Your overall thoughts on FaZe's win here, and then we can kind of break down the grand finals more specifically.
Yeah, I think, before we get into, too much of the nitty gritty of the series, I want to pose a question for you just in it's something I'm thinking about, and obviously, anyone listening knows I'm not asking this from a place of like trying to discredit FaZe or anything like that. I mean, I even picked FaZe to win this event, but just it's really an exercise of thought, but a thought exercise is how I want to say that. But um, the placing of in addition of the Esports World Cup to the tournament CDL cycle last year, right at the end of the season, uh, that additional tournament wasn't necessarily like the most. I don't know. I don't want to say there was an asterisk on it, but there was a, you know, just because Champs has been that end of season event for so long, I think the addition of an event after Champs kind of like put a damper on it. People weren't as excited for it, whatever you want to say about it. Um, and now people in the community, even the broadcaster, saying like it's a three-peat for FaZe, which I guess it technically it is. They have won the last three tournaments, but really they've won the last two CDL tournaments plus Esports World Cup. But now there's a component of the Esports World Cup partnering with the CDL, and like it's going to be a thing going forward. So the reason I got thinking about this is obviously as a UConn fan. UConn lost today. Their three-peat quest ended today, and the three-peat talk got me thinking about this, and everyone saying this is a three-peat. Do you view this as a three-peat? I think, it technically is, and it might just be my view of the World Cup, and it just not being that staple in the scene yet because it's only been a 1 year thing. But I'm gonna stop talking. What do you think about the like three-peat, or are they back-to-back CDL champs? How do you view it?
Yeah, that is not a three-peat in my opinion. I think if the World Cup was before Champs, and let's say like FaZe won the World Cup and then Champs and then the first major of the next season, I think you consider that three consecutive tournaments. But the way that the World Cup happened, and the fact that it just kind of came up out of nowhere, seemingly this important tournament or whatever. I think of it as just completely different thing. Like it's on its own. I would have a hard time arguing that FaZe has won three. I guess you could say they've won three consecutive tournaments because they have,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
I guess just terming it a three-peat is kind of lumping the Esports World Cup into the CDL majors, which I don't think is necessarily the right way to go. But yeah, it also is just a different game. And I think that is a big part of it. Like even if you won champs, OpTic winning champs last year, and then they win the first two majors, it's like, I don't know, like I just wouldn't, like I'm just not thinking three-peat. I'm just thinking, oh, they've won the last three tournaments, but I guess that's kind of semantics. It doesn't really, it means the same thing in the end. But I would never say like FaZe has a three-peat. If they win major three, then yeah, they've three-peated in this game. But I have a hard time just saying three-peat and thinking with the World Cup in mind.
That's how I view it too. I think it seems very like legalese to say it this way, but they've
Yeah.
won three consecutive tournaments, two consecutive CDL tournaments. That's the way I view it. And even saying that now, like it does feel a little weird because if you think back to like maybe like a team like Farico Impact, this was obviously Black Ops 2 when Champs was in March or just the beginning of the year, but I believe they won four straight tournaments at that point. And even then, there was like an MLG tournament, and I think it was a UMG tournament, or there was that other UGC. Maybe it was
Yeah.
a UGC and not a UMG. There was something else, so it wasn't like they didn't win three straight MLG tournaments and then champs. So like, it's not like this first thing. It's not the first time something like this has happened. And I don't think this is really like a debate or a criticism or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I was thinking about and I wanted to bring up. End of the day, FaZe is really freaking good, and they have won both tournaments to start this year. And I think that's the most important thing is I wanted to go back and look and I didn't. I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly that FaZe and Cold War, I think they didn't win the first two events. I'm pretty sure Toronto won major two. I
Yeah.
could be
No,
wrong.
that is correct.
So I don't think there's ever been back-to-back winners of the first two CDL majors where we're in a position to talk about, can this team win every event this season? And that's kind of like, where my head is at with this team, where I think that's, obviously the LAT curveball of what happened with them this weekend is unexpected. And I think, I would say right now, I don't think FaZe are going to win every event, just because I think they're eventually going to have to square up against LA Thieves in a finals again. And Thieves, just law of averages. They especially considering their last finals went game 7 round 11, you flip that, and, LA Thieves have a championship. So it makes me think like, it's just obviously really hard to even say like, yeah, they're going to win every event this year. But that's the first time we can even have this conversation. Like, sure, you can have it after the first event, but that doesn't mean as much as a team winning 2 events in the season. And then obviously there's only 2 majors, champs, and EWC left. But it is something interesting to think about, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, that not only is FaZe the first team in the CDL era to win back-to-back events to start the season, they're the first team since the World War II season that a team has done that. Team Caliber won the first 2 open events of that year,
of course.
Dallas and then New Orleans. And obviously they were one of the best teams throughout that entire game, ended up finishing second at champs. But, I think that is an interesting way to look at it, that they have the ability, not saying it is even likely, because we've seen in this major that, things can go awry. Like LA Thieves coming into this event were undoubtedly a contender. They looked unstoppable pretty much, and they lost to the Boston Breach. Like, we'll get into that, but like they lost to a team that we both thought was kind of just treading water. They had been kind of floundering as of late. LA Thieves have been in the completely opposite direction, and you get those results at the major. And if you look at Major 1, something similar happened with OpTic Texas. They were the number 1 seed coming in, just like LAT, and they lose the first round matchup, and it completely changes the trajectory of this bracket. Because we thought, okay, we're going to get LAT versus probably Vancouver in that second round. We're going to get FaZe versus maybe Toronto in that second round. Maybe we'll see FaZe versus LAT again in the winners finals, and then possibly another time in the grand finals. And we didn't even get to see that matchup at all this weekend, because LAT loses immediately. And if there are critics, I guess you could say, well, Atlanta didn't have to play LAT, but I would always say, like, you have to beat who you beat. Like LAT, like if FaZe maybe just wanted to like throw their games so they could go down to the losers bracket and play LAT, I guess they could do that. But at the end of the day, they beat Vancouver not once but twice, and that was a team that was really like, they've only, since Christmas, no other team has beaten Atlanta FaZe. So for them to kind of get that monkey off of their back, so to speak, because all of those results were online, but they get that revenge in pretty exciting fashion, pretty dominant fashion in the grand finals. And Vancouver had looked really, really good to that point too. So it wasn't like Vancouver was just like sleepwalking into the final. Like, no, they were a very, very good team, and they deserved to be there. But FaZe, I think, going back to my my first point in the podcast, like I'm just impressed because, one, like, it's very hard to repeat in this era of the CDL. Obviously FaZe in what'd you say? It was in Cold War. They dominated. That was kind of an anomaly. No other team has really done that. The New York Subliners, I think, when they won their world championship, they were like relatively dominant, and I think they won 2 majors and then champs, but they had that lull in between in the middle of the season. With FaZe, it's been very, very impressive. I think last year we had all different major champions. No team won more than one major, and then obviously OpTic Texas wins champs. And now FaZe has the ability to, obviously they've won 2. They could win more than that 3-4 majors, and they're definitively the best team in the game, which is not something that we can typically say. Like, we say it, but then it's always kind of like subject to change within the next few weeks, because the online results can change. But like, no matter what happens, unless FaZe goes like 0-7 in the qualifiers and pulls an OpTic or something, like, I just can't say in good conscience that FaZe is not the best team in the game until we see what happens at Major 3. So they have that buffer of like a month and a half now where they can say, yes, we are the best, and we're going to prove it. And if we even fall off, I'm still going to tout them as the best team in the game. And I think it is a big legacy win. It's a big thing for their legacy, I guess, to win this championship and to continue to improve their grand finals record, which has been much maligned as of late. But yeah, FaZe, they came into this grand finals having swept the Minnesota Rocker in the first round of the bracket. Then they beat Cloud9 New York in the second round 3-1. Like I said, they beat the Vancouver Surge in the winners finals 3-2. And then they beat Vancouver 4-0 in the grand finals. I don't think that was an expected result whatsoever. They win the first hard point in the grand finals by nearly 60 points. They dominate Search and Destroy. Celium just absolutely spits on Vancouver that entire map. A 3-2 win in control, and then the second hard point was a stomp where it looked like it was possibly going to be a 100-point club at one point, and then Vancouver was able to make it a little more competitive, but it was still like a 113-point win or whatever it was. So a really, really great victory for FaZe. Anything in the grand finals that stuck out to you or you want to talk about in particular?
Yeah, I think, you kind of touched on it. And the biggest thing for me with the grand finals is the fact that it was a 4-0. And as a result of it being a 4-0, that means FaZe beat Vancouver in hardpoint not once but twice. I tried to look back at the match. I can't go through my notes quick enough to find where they played Vancouver in my notes and the qualifier and which episodes those were. But obviously we know heading into this event, Vancouver had beaten FaZe twice in their first qualifier online match with Neptune, and then they beat them in the minor. And I'm just not sure if FaZe won a hard point in either of those matches. Maybe they won one, but regardless, hard point has been the talking point for Vancouver, and that's partly been revolving around their matchups with Thieves, where Thieves were winning the searches and the controls, and Vancouver was winning the hard points. But nonetheless, I think that's just the main topic around this Vancouver team is it felt like they've been a really great hardpoint team since the addition of Neptune. So when Vancouver and FaZe face off in the winners finals, they win both hardpoints there. FaZe win by Nesloing with the two S&Ds and the control. Then we go into the grand finals, and that's where my head is at. I'm like, this has the chance to be, a repeat of the Atlanta versus Thieves grand finals, where Thieves won those hard points, and Atlanta had to win one control and 3 searches, I believe, to capture the Major 1 title. So that's where I was thinking. But the fact that FaZe, especially now, like regardless of what happened in those other 2 matchups online, just a couple hours before the grand finals, FaZe failed to win a hard point against Vancouver when they had previously lost series to them and most likely didn't have a strong hard point record in that individual matchup. And they're able to win 2 hard points. They closed it out on a hard point where, like you said, it was a stomp. They literally, they kind of didn't even mention it in the on the broadcast, but I obviously enjoyed it just because I'm a fan of the weird interactions in COD. But Cell went for the to take 04 hostage, and you kind of alluded to it, they were chirping and Cell was just doing his little trash talk when they were walking out after map 2, and Cell went for the melee, and 04 just turned at the last second to avoid it, and it gave him a hit marker instead of letting him take him hostage. And I thought that would have been the funniest thing to me if Cell, especially just because he was talking trash to 04, and he would have been in-game chat doing his little annoying voice in 04's ear and potentially teabagging him into a wall as FaZe win the map. That would have been just absolute peak cinema to me. I would have loved that. But obviously you're not going for those. I'm not saying in a 250, 249 game, you're not going to try and take someone hostage at the end of a hard point, right? And I think that's I don't think there's anything that drastically changed between all the 3 previous matchups and these 2 hard points in the grand finals to the point where we're Surge is winning the hard points to FaZe almost winning by over 100. But I think that's just like, you know, just shows what this team is capable of. And I think there was a breaking point interview post tournament with Crowder where Crowder said like he thought Neptune did a really good job taking some unprecedented or weird routes in the winners finals that kind of caught the team off guard, and then heading into the grand finals they kind of prepared a little bit more, just in the sense of like knowing that might be something Neptune is going to do, like kind of like expect the unexpected when it comes to Neptune if you know he's alive. And that might just be the obviously Crowder and them aren't going to try and give away the secrets if they found something out really quickly to like kind of counteract Neptune, who has been one of the best SNGs since his return to the CDL. But that's something I'm going to be interested in, especially if maybe they found something out that, especially for Vancouver FaZe matchups going forward now, if Neptune doesn't adapt, like maybe FaZe has figured it out in terms of the hard point. I don't know. That's something I'm going to be keeping my eye on. But yeah, not looking too far ahead, just this finals in general. I thought it was a really strong performance from FaZe, like you said, and that just the fact they were able to win 2 hard points when they just an hour ago or 2 hours beforehand lost a couple hard points, that spoke volumes to me. The search was really good. They didn't lose a search all weekend, I believe, because they only lost 3 maps. They 3-0'd Rocker, like you said, 3-1 C9. I believe that was a control. Then 3-2'd Vancouver, and those were both hard points. So I'm pretty sure they went undefeated in search this weekend, which, Ego Chall enthusiasts will know. We always say search wins championships. So shout out to FaZe there. And then last thing really for me for the grand finals, I got to shout out Celium. 1.72 KD to post the highest finals KD in CDL history. Just going to repeat that. A 1.72 KD in the finals, which is the highest in CDL history. Not going to toot my own horn, but, last episode I said FaZe going to win the event and Celium's my MVP pick. My March Madness bracket might not be looking too hot, but I was able to nail those picks at least. So shout out Cell. He played lights out, and really, like, I was trying to think about it too. The only thing that really comes close in my mind is I don't even remember if it was only in the finals or maybe it was on Sunday of IW champs, but everyone talks about IW formal and champs formal, and I'm pretty sure he had like a 1.45, but I don't remember if that was for the whole event, if it was just the finals or just at champs or just that Sunday. I don't think it was just Sunday because I'm pretty sure Karma played pretty well in the finals, so I can't remember. But that's like, when we're talking 1.7 in the finals, that's like literally, I know it's history, but like I can't really think of anything else that comes close to that. It was just a dominant performance from FaZe, but especially dominant from Cell individually too.
So in those first 2 series between Vancouver and FaZe, I was looking up while you're talking. They split the hard points in those series. So FaZe won each of the first hard points, and then they lost the second. But I thought it was interesting because in each of those 2 series, the first hard point was Vault hard point, and FaZe won each of those. And then in the first series, it was Protocol hard point. Vancouver wins by more than 100. In the second series, it was Hacienda hard point. Vancouver wins by nearly 80. And then in the winners finals, it was Vault hard point, which obviously, like I just said, FaZe had been 2-0 against Vancouver with this roster. Vancouver wins that map in the winners finals, and then they play red card hard point in the second hard point, and Vancouver wins that as well. In the grand finals, it was Protocol hard point, which again, like I said, Vancouver had won by more than 100 in that first series that they played each other. FaZe wins it this time. They play Hacienda. Vancouver had won that map against FaZe by nearly 80 points. It was a complete dominant performance by FaZe on that map. So FaZe kind of fixed some of the things, the maps that they lost to with the surge previously. It seemed like they addressed some of those concerns. Maybe it was just a fluke in some of those instances. I'm not entirely sure, but I think if you want to be optimistic about it, that they fixed what was happening on Protocol and Hacienda in particular, and they ended up winning this series as a result, or this grand final series so dominantly as a result. And but yeah, they're incredible. Like, this is one of the greatest teams. Obviously we've been talking, like, in terms of talent, this is one of the most talented teams we've ever seen in competitive Call of Duty. For former world champions is kind of rare, in general, but they have a real chance to, win 3-4 majors this season, and really kind of boost, their rankings, I guess, if you want to say, because we've talked about it in the past about Simp and Abizi in particular, and like where they rank in terms of the all-time list. Winning these events with how few majors are out there in a given season, winning these events is very, very important for that. So obviously congratulations to Atlanta FaZe on a very great performance this entire weekend. Winning the only Game 5 of the entire tournament is also very impressive. Like, the fact that I think, what was it? I think it might have been Major 1, but there were points or tournaments where we saw Game 5 after Game 5, and we have these long days that are so drawn out, and we didn't get any of that this weekend. It was rather quick. I can't remember the last time that there was only one Game 5 in a single tournament. I don't know if you can.
No, and they said it on the Scump Watch Party. There was one of the Money Hill Stats Twitter account and Brian Stats at points this weekend. I saw them keeping track and tweeting like how many series it had been since the last Game 5. I didn't see them have a post with the final number, but on the Scump Watch Party, they said it was 24 consecutive series played in the CDL without a Game 5 before that Vancouver Atlanta Game 5. And yeah, like you said, there were literally, I'm pretty sure there was a day at Major 1. It was either day 1 or it wasn't day 1, I don't think, because no, maybe it was. I don't remember. It was either day 1 or day 2 of Major 1, where it was almost all Game 5s. And, to only have an event with one and to have a streak of so many, I don't want to say blowouts, because obviously like a 3-1 isn't as much of a blowout as a 3-0, but there's just, that when they're Game 5 round 11 is Call of Duty esports. Like, people live for that shit, and they love that. So to be deprived of that, it doesn't necessarily take away from the entire experience of the tournament, but it's definitely like you expect to see more than one Game 5 in a tournament. So that is a little strange. I think, it's more of a overall picture, or just a look at this landscape of the CDL right now, but it does feel like, especially until we know what rosters are going to look like heading into Major 3, like it's starting to feel a little more separated in terms of, like, you got your top of the leaderboard, and then the middle of the pack, and the teams that are inevitably not going to be at champs. It feels like that's starting to become a little more defined. So we'll be talking about all these teams over the next couple episodes as we break it down, so I don't got to get too much into it. But yeah, I think maybe some roster changes will help, give us some more Game 5s. But in a world where not a lot of roster changes happen and we keep seeing these same teams square up, it might be just a case where the top teams are continuing to dominate. But obviously, you got matchups like LAT and Boston, which you don't expect to go to a Game 5 because you're probably thinking LAT win 3-0, and then that's not what happens.
Yeah, and I want to say last thing on FaZe before we can kind of move into the Vancouver direction. FaZe is now, obviously they were the only team to have won back-to-back majors before this. So in Cold War, they won Major 3 and Major 4 consecutively, and that is previously, that was the only time that any team had done that, not including like times that like New York or LAT won the final major of the season and then went on to win champs in the next tournament. So this is just majors, but I thought that was interesting that they're the only team to have done it, and they've now done it twice. And on your point about the separation within the CDL, I do think, especially because this is the, so to speak, the midway point of the year, that there might be some big roster changes coming, or at least we haven't really gotten that roster mania period yet. We've had like a roster change here and roster change there, but we haven't had a full-blown roster mania yet. And I think that's probably going to happen here if I had to guess. And I think it's going to affect quite a few teams in the league, I would imagine.
It has to happen if it's going to happen now, because they said it on the Scump watch party. And when they said it, I didn't believe it because it didn't feel like it could be true. But Scump said it because they were talking about OpTic afterwards, and they said we only have 10 online qualifier matches and 2 majors left before champs. And I was like, there's no way that can be true. And because there's no minors in the Major 3 and Major 4 cycles, there aren't 7 qualifier matches for each team. There's only 5. So, just going to use Vegas for an example because it's, an unfortunate truth at this point. But, 5 qualifier matches in each major cycle and then showing up to the major potentially in the losers bracket, a team like Vegas realistically only has 12 series left until their season is over. And, that's not, I'll say like a team like Minnesota, who they've been very up and down this year. If they continue to struggle, they realistically only have like 12 is the minimum number of series you can play this year before your season ending. And that's like, it just feels like that crept up very fast, that, and maybe it's just because there are fewer qualifiers in before Major 3 and Major 4 that's why it feels like that. But it feels like that number is very low. And we're realistically even beyond the halfway point, even though it is halfway in terms of the majors, just because of the number of matches remaining. So there has to be a sense of urgency for some of these teams, especially, I said Minnesota, we'll talk about Minnesota later, but if there is going to be a big roster mania, it feels like it has to happen before the Major 3 qualifiers, because then you get to the point before the Major 4 qualifiers where it's like, you almost know which teams are in or out, unless you got like a New York situation from Vanguard where they go on that miracle run. So yeah, interesting times ahead for sure.
Yeah, so we're 3.5 months into the season so far, and not counting champs. So like Major 4 is 2 months from today. That's when Major 4 starts, and that is the end of the season, at least for a quarter of the league. And that's the last chance to get some CDL points, and then there's about a month break before champs in Toronto. So it's going to be interesting, I think, just to see what changes are made, who makes these changes. Even like a team like OpTic that we talked about quite a bit over the last few weeks, they might be not forced, but might be enticed to make another change just because this is the time to kind of shuffle your roster while everyone else is doing it, and maybe not lose as much ground as if you do it in 3, 4, or 5 weeks. But let's talk about Vancouver, a team that did make a change before the Major 2 qualifiers, and it was the best possible change that they could have made. They go from a team at Major 1. We talked about it afterwards. You even said, like, I don't know what this team is. Like, they need a roster change, and you're kind of writing them off, like, in that current form, and it seemed rightfully so. They make that change. They bring in Neptune, and they beat FaZe twice, as we've said multiple times on this show, in the qualifier, or once in the qualifiers, once in the minor. They look very competitive against LA Thieves in the second minor grand finals, going to a Game 7. They are one of the top teams in the Major 2 qualifiers, and then they come into Major 2 and they get to the grand finals after, I believe, getting first rounded in Major 1. So Vancouver, they sweep the Carolina Royal Ravens in the first round. They beat the Boston Breach, who had upset the LA Thieves. They beat the Breach in the second round. Of course, they lose to Atlanta FaZe in the winners finals, and then they beat the Toronto Ultra, who had looked really great since that first round loss, had made a very, very impressive run, sweeping every single team in the losers bracket until Vancouver wins that and they get into the grand finals. What do you think the ceiling is for Vancouver here? Because Obviously, the grand finals is disappointing. It's kind of, if you had to make a comparison, maybe like the Toronto Ultra, not nearly as painful, but the Toronto Ultra in the grand finals a few years ago at Champs, where they look like a really great team and then they just lay an egg in the grand finals and kind of get, I would say, embarrassed, but like it's certainly not an embarrassment to finish second. Where do you think Vancouver goes from here after getting second at Major 2?
I don't know where they go from here, but I think to, just overall for them, like they if they weren't already considered a top three team in the game, they have to be considered a top three team in the game at this point right now. I think heading into this tournament, I posed the question, and I think other people in the community were wondering it. Like it was all fine and dandy to see how well they played with Neptune in the online qualifiers and in the minor, but the overarching question was, how was this team going to perform on LAN? Was the online performance going to translate to LAN for this team? There's a lot of like people saying, Neptune might be an onliner, yada yada, and he shut that shit down, proved he can do it on LAN here, and I think that's like, yeah, obviously disappointing for that camp that they weren't able to, hoist the trophy, but they have to be proud, like kind of mentioned, just the turnaround since Neptune joined the camp. That, to what we were just talking about a couple minutes ago, that shows is a really good example of what can happen when you are proactive in the age and roster mania market and make a move, make a move maybe a little quicker than some other teams that haven't made a move and have struggled as a result of not changing. So I think that's just, I'm pretty sure it was Brian Stats who tweeted it. It was the first top three finish for Abuza and 04 and maybe Neptune. And then obviously Nasty had the second place finish at EWC last year, but I think like they not, again, if you don't count that, they mentioned something of like a top three finish in Vanguard. So regardless, it's just a team with not a lot of, top echelon placings, and this is just a really good step in the right direction for them. I think the only, again, like you said with FaZe, you got to play the team put in front of you. I think based on the matchups we saw in the minor and qualifiers between Surge and Thieves, I definitely wanted to see them play on LAN at this event, and we didn't get to see that. So that's, anybody who doesn't want to put Vancouver in their top three, that's like maybe one of the counter arguments is we got to see them play FaZe twice. We didn't get to see them play Thieves on LAN, but regardless of that, I just think that this team has been, they lost in this finals to FaZe, but they're a team that has beaten FaZe this year. They haven't beaten Thieves, but they were competitive in the minors grand finals, which was the best of 7. So that has to matter for something in some regard, whether you just weigh the, regardless of what you think of online COD, it has to, when it's the only thing we have to measure the two teams and how they stack up to one another, like it has to count for something. So I think, yeah, like at this point, just the way Vancouver's played, they are pretty solidly, at worst, they're a top 4 team. They made it to the top 4 championship Sunday. So I don't think you can really argue that. I would probably say they're the third best team in the game right now. But yeah, I think the hard point is really strong. If I'm going to, not necessarily be critical, but just a little, analytical, I would like to see how they look to improve in search and control, to kind of like not put so much pressure on their hard point, for lack of better phrasing, because I don't think it's necessarily like they feel like they have to win a hard point to win series, because obviously they're winning series like 3-0, 3-1. So it's not the end of the world if they don't win a hard point, but obviously if you improve in those other modes, it just, naturally doesn't put as much pressure on that one mode that you realistically rely on consistently. So that's what I'm going to look for going forward for this team. I think, Neptune played well this weekend. I still think Abuza has just really improved. I feel like when Neptune first came into this roster in those online qualifiers, it really felt like, Nasty obviously had a really pop off performance in the first match against FaZe. Then after that, it was really Neptune for a decent amount being the, far and away the best player on the team. And then really since the minor grand finals, I think Abuza has just stepped it up and he has played really, really well. Like we saw last year, he played really well towards the end of the year. So I'm going to look to see how he continues to develop, because if it's like last year, like, and he just continues to get better, then this team can realistically continue to compete for, not only making it to championship Sundays at the last few events, but realistically that they could continue to be in the finals.
I was actually going to bring that up about the hard point. That is the one thing that I am most concerned about in terms of kind of the longevity, or if Vancouver can kind of replicate the success over and over again. It's the fact that they do rely so heavily on one game mode in particular. So since Neptune has joined the lineup, they are 21-8 in hardpoint. That's like over 70%. I believe that's one. Just based on that number, they would be one of, if not the top hardpoint team in the game. And then in search and destroy and control combined, they're 19-20. So they're just below 500. That puts so much stress on your hardpoint that if you don't win the opening hardpoint, it's like it could be do or die at that point. And it shouldn't be like that. Hopefully, for their sake, they can improve a little bit, get a little bit over 500. Obviously, you can't make these giant swings, and you're probably not going to turn from a 50% hardpoint team to a 80% hardpoint, or search and destroy team. You're not going to turn into an 80% S&D team overnight, but it certainly does need to improve, especially when you're going up against LAT and FaZe, who are probably the two best hardpoint teams in the game. The fact that they can take hard points off of you, not easily, but certainly with consistency, that makes it so tough. And I think that played out in the grand finals. I think the fact that FaZe kind of punched them in the mouth, they took that opening hard point and then were obviously able to close it out on hard point. I think that's kind of a surprise considering how well Vancouver has played in that game mode to this point. So they're going to have to step it up in S&D. They got ran over in that search in the grand finals. So they have a ways to go, but I don't want to be negative and say like, oh my God, look how bad they are or whatever. I think that is just the changing expectations of this team. Before, we wouldn't even be having this talk before the Major 2 qualifiers. We didn't expect them to be in this position, and we wouldn't be criticizing them very heavily if we're like, yeah, they win like 75% of their hard points and they're like 50-50 and S&D and control. Would be like, that's great. Look at Vancouver. They're doing great. But now that they are a legitimate contender, I do believe like you that they are one of the top 3 teams in the game at this point. But they have to continue to improve. They can't stagnate because I'm sure that Atlanta FaZe and LA Thieves, those two teams are going to improve or really going to try to do something to take it to the next level. As we saw with FaZe this time around, I think they did learn from those losses to Vancouver earlier in Major 2 qualifiers and in the minors. So we'll see what happens with Vancouver, but this is an incredible turnaround. It's very rare that you see a team be able to do this, go from kind of a bottom dweller to, or whatever you want to call it, to a top 3 contender within the span of 6-7 weeks. That's pretty rare.
Yeah, and I think to their credit too, like they got the right guy at the helm in Rambo to, like, if the inverse was true, where Vancouver was really good at search and they needed to improve in hardpoint. Obviously, we've talked about Rambo. He is one of the best minds in Call of Duty history. He wasn't exactly known for being a superstar slayer, dropping massive KDs, though. He was definitely more known for his S&D. So if that was the case and they needed to improve in hardpoint, I'd be like, yeah, maybe they got to bring, hardpoint coach hasn't really been a thing, but it's like, maybe they got to bring someone in to help Rambo and try and improve the hardpoint. But the position they're in now, where they got to improve S&D, they got Rambo. He's definitely going to be able to help them, I feel like, in search. And I just think overall, like, even saying like improving in search doesn't like you broke it down, but like I feel like that's against these top teams like LA Thieves and FaZe because well, one example, obviously just limited sample size from this event, but looking at that winners round 2 matchup for Vancouver against Boston, they lose the first hard point 250 to 248 was an absolute banger. Neptune dropped 47 kills for the loss, but then they win the control, the search, and the game 4 hard point, and they close it out 3-1. So it's again, it's not like they're losing all of their search and destroys. It's just maybe they have to improve in search against the teams like Thieves and FaZe if they want to continue being in a position to play against those teams for championships. I think that's a good way to word it.
Yeah, and that sample size that I pulled out of since Neptune, they've played either Atlanta, Toronto, or LAT like 8 times out of like 14 matches total. So like they're playing really good teams very recently, and that's something because if you're putting yourself in the position, especially when you have the minor as well, you get to play those good teams the farther that you get along into those tournaments. So they played FaZe, LAT, and Toronto, 3 of the top 4, top 5 teams, a bunch in the last month and a half or 2 months, which is a very good thing for them in terms of practice. One team I think we need to talk about, LA Thieves. This was the shock of the tournament. One of the more shocking results of the season. They, I predicted them to win Major 2. I predicted them to win Major 1. I don't think, I think you said the way you phrased it, I think was like maybe your brain, basically we were trying to be different. We didn't want to pick LA Thieves. But I think like, if I picked FaZe, I feel like you were probably going to pick LA Thieves.
Yeah.
And, we ended up doing it vice versa. We thought those teams were on kind of even playing field and were definitively the 2 best teams. And you could still make that argument. But this weekend did not show LA Thieves at their best. They lose to the Boston Breach in winners round 1, 3-1. Like I said at the beginning of the show, Boston had been trending downward, or certainly were they're kind of on the bubble, so to speak. When we're talking about champs qualification, there's certainly no lock to make champs this season. While LA Thieves are, the best or second best team coming into this tournament, and had gotten really, really close to winning Major 1, had won 10 matches in a row before this major, and then they come in and they lay I can't say lay an egg because they did win a map, but this was about as bad of a series as you could expect from LAT playing against this caliber of opponent. Granted, it was a very close series, but it shouldn't be a close series. That's kind of the thing. A 20-point hard point win for Boston in game 1. They ended up winning the second hard point 250 to 242. So both of these hard points are very close, and Boston won the search as well, 6-4. The only win in that series for LAT was a 3-0 vault control win. And then, LAT does kind of redeem themselves in a way, right? They come in, they beat Miami, they beat Carolina, and then they beat Cloud9 as well in the losers bracket. And they look like, I think even Shane might have tweeted this. I think he said, we had a slow start, but we're back or something like that. I think that might have been after the C9 win. And then they come into the losers semis and get swept by the Toronto Ultra. And I just don't know. I don't know what to think of this performance in all honesty. I don't think LAT are the whatever they are, the 4th best team in the league. I think they're better than that. But what did you see from them? Why do you think this weekend was so bad compared to what we've seen of LAT recently?
I think in general, like, we'll start a little less serious. I think I texted it to you, but this is now the second event of Black Ops 6 where the number 1 seed has lost the first match in the winners bracket to open up the tournament. So maybe there's a little bit of number 1 seed curse going on, and maybe we'll have to see what happens next event. But regardless of what you think about that, I think it's we saw what LA Thieves are capable of the way they played on Friday and Saturday. We did not see them at their best on Thursday and Sunday today. Um, and there really wasn't any like sign to me as to why this is what happened. I mean, undefeated in the qualifiers. They only lost control, I believe, in the qualifiers, so they hadn't lost a hard point or a search heading into this tournament, and then they lose the first hard point they play at this tournament and the first search they play in this tournament. And to Boston's credit, I mean, Snoopy played really well. So, excuse me, you do have to, you know, if somebody, it's not like they lost 250, 230 map one to Boston, 6-4 in the search. So it's not like they got 100-point clubbed and 6-1, 6-0 in the search. They were close maps, but that's just not what you expected in that showdown between these two teams based on how they played in the recent sample size. So I really don't have a good answer to explain why that happened. I mean, just a slow start. We've talked about that really with past OpTic teams pre CDL era. Like that was a thing. They would start out slow on the first day of tournaments, and like if they didn't lose in those first days, it felt like they were just going to win the whole tournament. And then if they started slow, it was like, oh, they're going to make a loser bracket run and somehow, get to the final still. But yeah, that's just really like, you know, it felt weird watching. I was kind of confused how it happened, but then we get into the loser bracket run, and the Thieves that you expect to see showed up. They really like they stomped Carolina for like the third or fourth time this season already. Beat Miami, beat the Cloud9, sorry, and then they face off against Ultra today. And I think today's matches. Again, this is before we see FaZe and Vancouver play each other. Like I really thought there was a strong chance Thieves were just gonna win every match today to take the whole thing, just based on how they played the last 2 days. But then it was really just a case of, like I said, the Thieves that was playing on Friday and Saturday wasn't the Thieves that we saw today. It was closer to the Thieves we saw on Thursday. So and really the one in this that showed out to or stood out to me was the first map against Toronto, 250 to 115. Don't have the exact number to support this claim, but I feel like it's a safe bet that has to be the Thieves' worst hardpoint loss of the season so far. Mainly if there's been 100-point score or 100-point club and a hard point that Thieves have been playing, they are the ones winning that one. I can't think of a time they've been super dominated in a hard point like that. And Nadeshot was on the Scump watch party saying that he thought that Protocol hardpoint was one of the team's most banned hard points so far this season. And the guy Riley, who produces the Scump watch party, like didn't give a number, but it felt like you don't hear him on the watch party, but he said something that seemed like that was on track. I don't know how accurate it is, but regardless,
I have the number. It's
go ahead.
So Protocol Hardpoint is not their least picked, because I guess Rewind would technically be their least picked.
Okay.
But other than that, Protocol is their least picked hardpoint and their most vetoed hardpoint. They've only picked it 5 times and they vetoed it 20 times. In comparison, Red Card is their second most vetoed, and that's 16 vetoes. So yeah, that is true. They have kind of shied away from that map in particular, and if this result is any indication, now you know why.
Yeah, but I mean that's obviously one map. It's not the reason they lost this whole series. I think the search is close 6-4 against Toronto, but then Thieves have been the best control team this year and recently, and they get 3-0 stomped by Toronto to get sent home packing in this tournament. So that was just a confusing, turn of events, I guess, just based on, again, don't want to discredit Toronto either, because Thieves in their loser bracket run to that match only lost one map. Toronto hadn't lost any maps. They were 9-0 in the loser bracket, at least, heading into that match with Thieves. They win that 3-0 to go 12-0 in the loser bracket before losing to Surge. So both teams were on fire, and Toronto was just able to capitalize on they maybe there's something in the map veto process where Toronto got to pick that protocol, and Thieves felt like they had to veto another hard point against them. I don't really know. But when they are so dominant in control too, and Toronto, or I'm sorry, when Thieves are so dominant in control and Toronto is able to stomp them as convincingly as they did in that like mode, that's almost been a guarantee for Thieves. That just shows like this was this was Toronto series all in every single facet. So I don't big picture takeaways, I don't really have anything. I mean, I think like I said, it was a case of different days. We saw the dominant Thieves show up on Friday and Saturday, and they didn't show up on Thursday and Sunday. So it's just for them, it's going to be trying to figure out how to, get back to that consistent showcase of them, religiously being at their best every single day. That's kind of I didn't word that right, but this is a team one undefeated in the qualifiers. They could very easily go undefeated. I don't know what their schedule looks like for the Major 3 qualifiers, but like we could be sitting here and they go 5-0 in the Major 3 qualifiers and are the 1 seed again heading into Major 3. Wouldn't surprise me. It's just I think something didn't go their way. I don't think it's any major concerns for the team. They're still really good, really gross. Just a unexpected result based on how dominant they had been looking heading into the tournament.
LA Thieves had not lost protocol control at all this season. Like you said, they are the best control team in the league, and they were 8-0 on protocol control before today's match against Toronto. But on the other hand, Toronto, I think, is a pretty good control team. At least on 2 of the maps, like they're 7-4 on vault control, 6-3 on protocol, and then they're 2-4 on hacienda. So like, they're 13-7, so they're winning 65-70% of their controls on vault or protocol. So like if they pick one of those 2 maps, I think they could beat most teams, and maybe that made people think that LAT could not be beaten there, but they certainly can, and they have things to work out. And for them, I think it's disappointing just because the fact that they didn't even get to the grand finals. I think it'd be different if you get to the grand finals, you lose to Atlanta FaZe, and then you're like, okay, like what do we have to fix here? Because we were so close at Major 1. Now, like you didn't even get to the losers finals, and I think that is really what stings. And obviously the Boston match is kind of inexcusable. Like I know COD is fluky and it's unpredictable, but I think if you look at it, FaZe was able to make it through, and they had some tough opponents. Vancouver was able to make it through. They beat Boston, the same team that beat LAT. I think that's just like something like LAT should not have let that happen. I would love to hear more from those guys, just to hear what might have happened in that series, because I think I mentioned it on the preview, but Boston had previously beaten LAT in the Major 1 qualifiers as well. And that was kind of like, if you're optimistic about Boston chances, it's that they are one of the few teams to have beaten LAT at this point. But, since then it had been all LAT, but, it was not meant to be, I guess, for the Thieves in Allen, Texas. The last team that we'll talk about today, so like Bink had mentioned earlier, because we only have so much time in a podcast, I guess we could theoretically podcast for like 5 or 6 hours, but I don't think anybody really wants that. How we'll do it, because we have that break next week, there's no matches or anything, we're going to continue to break down the performances of some of these teams at the majors, all 12 teams actually, and we're expecting 11 teams and the challengers team that is somehow in the CDL. But we will break them all down. We'll talk about them. We do expect roster changes, so we could change who we're thinking about technically based on the roster changes or when those might happen. But today we're talking about Atlanta, Vancouver, LAT, and the next team will be OpTic. We'll finish out, I guess, on a weird note. And then the we're planning to talk about like Toronto, C9, Boston, Carolina on the next show. That is subject to change. Obviously, we'll see what the roster changes, and then talk about Minnesota, Miami, LAG, and Vegas a week from now. And then we'll get back into our regularly scheduled programming. We'll update our power rankings before the major 3 qualifiers. See if anything has changed in that. But we just kind of want to let you know. On that note, let's talk about OpTic, because they were the talk of the town, so to speak, heading into this event. Of course, they were hosting this event. The event was in the same arena that they won the World Championship in last summer. And of course, they make this roster change last week. They drop Kenny, who was a part of that World Championship winning roster. They bring in Skyz from LAG. And I think there was a lot of curiosity around this team. How will they respond to this change? What will the ring ceremony be like? How awkward will that be? What if they get just smoked in that first series that they play in the losers bracket? They get eliminated. What happens then? I think it's not the best case scenario, obviously, but this was a very good step for them. At least this was some kind of momentum, even if it was kind of taken away the very or 2 days later or whatever. So OpTic, they win 3-0 against the Minnesota Rocker in losers round 1. Obviously Minnesota had lost to FaZe 3-0 in winners round 1. OpTic gets that sweep. They get that win on LAN, which had to feel good. And then they go and they play Toronto in losers round 2. They get swept 3-0. Beans kind of talking his shit was pretty funny. Toronto just in general played incredibly well this weekend, especially in the losers bracket. So I'm not entirely sure if it's like Toronto was just so good or OpTic was so bad. But of course, OpTic losing 3-0 has been a trend recently, even before this roster change. And I don't know what fans are thinking, because I'm not an OpTic fan. I'm not like in the green wall. I'm not in the trenches, so to speak. But I would think that there's, okay, like we made some progress, but the fact that they lost convincingly to Toronto, the fact that they did not make a run here, I would imagine there's probably like, is Skyz the guy? And there were probably that thought before this weekend as well. What do you think of OpTic's, I can't say run, but their performances at Major 2, and kind of, is Skyz, if you were in charge of OpTic, now that you have Skyz on this roster, is he someone that you're going to keep through what we expect to be the biggest roster mania period of the season?
Yeah, so I think we got to go back a little bit and revisit the phrasing around the Kenny situation. There was a clip from like an OpTic podcast or something that dropped either on the Thursday or Friday of this major, where Hex said that Kenny effectively stepped down from the team. So it wasn't a position where he was released. I believe what Hex said was that he texted Karma and said that he thought the team might want to pick up somebody else who would help them perform better. And that's what led to the Skyz move. So I think, that goes back to a little bit of what I was saying, maybe not last episode, but just over the course of this OpTic losing streak, was that it really felt like to me that they didn't want to make a change, and they wanted to try and stick it out with the team that won champs last year. But then Kenny made the decision to step down, and that's what led to Skyz joining the team. And I think you can look at that in multiple ways, in the sense of the team didn't want to make a change, so maybe they won't make another change. Or you can look at it as they didn't want to make a change and they had to make a change because Kenny stepped down. So Skyz was a temporary fill-in because he was, a restricted free agent or just on the bench. So he was an option who was in the area and available. So I don't know where they go from here. There was a clip of Temp on the flank saying that he was in some calls with Dashy and Kenny that made him feel like that just the chemistry was off on that team. And like Temp basically, like, I haven't heard much from Temp really at all, just because he hasn't been competing, he hasn't been talking much like in a place that I've seen. But obviously we know Kenny and Temp have that like, relationship and friendship together. So I'm in no position to doubt what Temp is saying, but that I think, just the overall thought, I still think it would be weird because I feel like Pred played very well this weekend. Again, small sample size. But I do think if OpTic were to make a change, like it would just replacing Skyz after 2 matches and bringing in another AR, I really don't know how much that changes things for OpTic. That's what makes me think like they would have to make a 2-person change. And we've been over this now a couple of times. Like it feels like Shotzi and Dashi, as long as they want to be on OpTic, they are going to be on OpTic, which would mean that Pred and Skyz would be the odd men out. And then which 2 people are going to be, quote unquote upgrades over Pred and Skyz, unless you're just looking again for, replacements to improve the chemistry. But that was like a big selling point for Skyz and like his interview with Scump and whatnot, saying like he's going to bring the vibes and whatnot. And so I don't know. I really don't know what I can, again, I think you can look at it from multiple ways. The way I'm viewing it right now is I would be very surprised if OpTic just dumped Skyz after 2 matches based on like how much, just the conversation around all this and stuff, making it feel like they didn't want to move on from Kenny makes me believe they won't want to move on from Skyz either, especially so quickly. But like I said a little while ago, and the reason like Scump was bringing up the matches remaining just because, OpTic are not like when he had brought it up, Cloud9 were still in the winners bracket. They hadn't played FaZe yet. In that winners bracket showdown, and I think it was even before Boston played against Vancouver. So they were looking at the standings on Scump's watch party, and they're like, we're really not even like super safe in terms of making it to champs if those 2 teams get some more points at this event. Obviously the results for those teams went in OpTic's favor, and OpTic's in 6th place right now in the CDL standings, but that is not a comfortable lead. They're tied with Boston, only 10 points ahead of Miami, and only 15 points ahead of C9, 20 points ahead of Minnesota. So, like, if they struggle again in these major 3 qualifiers, it really we could realistically be looking at OpTic not qualifying for champs, which would be catastrophic for a number of reasons, but the biggest being, like, well, what's the viewership going to look like for a COD champs without OpTic involved? That would be not good in my belief. So, yeah, I think, overall, I do think it had to feel good for OpTic and the Green Wall in general to get that win in the first round against Minnesota. But then, like you said, like they got 3-0'd by Toronto with Kenny, then they get 3-0'd by Toronto with them with Skyz in this match on land. So not sure how much you can really take away from that. I do just think Toronto is a better team right now than either iteration of OpTic, just because I think OpTic beat Toronto with Hook to end the Major 1 qualifiers, but that's 3 different iterations of the team, and Toronto's beaten 2 out of 3 of them. So, I mean, it's obviously OpTic is always under a microscope already, but just the position they put themselves in with this lackluster performance in the Major 2 cycle is, that they're just in a position that they aren't really used to, I feel like, and they obviously it's a position no team wants to be in, let alone OpTic. So, it'll be interesting to see what position where they go from here. I will say, sort of, I feel like a broken record at this point, but if there is some major domino to fall in roster mania that we just aren't expecting, that could either be OpTic making a big splash for a player that you didn't think was going to be available to them, or one of these other teams making a big move and then somebody else becoming available, and then that is a domino effect where OpTic's able to take that player. I really don't know what those moves would be, and that's really what I've been saying for a while now. So I don't know what the answer for OpTic is, but I mean, 2 matches with Skyz. The fact that they've now said, Hex has said that Kenny stepped down, he wasn't dropped. They didn't really want to make a change. At least that's the feeling around it. And in my eyes, that makes me believe they're going to try and ride this out with Skyz now, but we'll have to wait and see.
See, that's actually, I kind of think the opposite. I don't know if there will be a change. I'll say that. But the place in the standings and the fact that Kenny had, stepped down instead of being released. So this wasn't like, at least according to Hex, it was not like a premeditated thing. Like we're getting rid of him and then we're bringing in Skyz to kind of like steady the boat, so to speak. Instead, it's Kenny steps down. Okay, like we're gonna get Skyz, I guess, and then like you don't perform well at the major. I think if they had made this run, maybe if they made what Toronto did, like if they were able to do something like that, of course, Skyz is probably safe. You're gonna ride it out, see what happens in the Major 3 qualifiers, see what happens at Major 3. Okay, but now you lose, you win one match against a team that probably will make a roster change, or probably should, I guess. And then you lose to a team that, had a really good run, but I think OpTic should be better than. So I don't know where you go from here with OpTic. I think the fact that Kenny stepped down does not lend itself to Skyz being safe by any means, or that they won't make another roster change or 2 more roster changes. And I was also just looking at the standings while you were reading them off. Like the top 5 teams, I'd be really surprised if Atlanta, LAT, Toronto, Carolina, or Vancouver, if any of those teams make a change before the Major 3 qualifiers. I think it's safe to say that those teams are comfortable with where they are in the standings and they're not going to make a change. I think everybody else, it's kind of up in the air or more leaning toward, hey, we're making a change. I think the one thing you could say is like, obviously, Vegas is different because they have the Saudi roster. Miami is different because they have the Spanish roster. And then you could say Cloud9 also because they looked better in the Major 2 qualifiers. They performed okay at Major 2. Maybe you're thinking, okay, we're trending upward. We're not going to make a change. But I still think any of those 7 teams, including OpTic, are at risk to make a change or multiple before we get to the Major 3 qualifiers.
So I will say, I think we'll talk more about this whenever we end up talking about Miami. But the one interesting component about the Miami team is Real, in the sense that he was going to play for Carolina on a non-Spanish team last year before the visa stuff happened. I believe, I mean, I think you do too, but not going to speak for you necessarily. I think it's been clear cut since really the end of last season. Obviously, initially when Real first joined Miami, they had some growing pains, but they really, as the season progressed, they got better as a team, and I think Real was the best player on the team at that point. I think he's been the best player on the team this year, so I would be very surprised if Miami decided to move Real, but he has the potential to play for another team if another team makes an offer that Miami can't refuse. And obviously, Lucky and Metals, dude, like they were a part of that Toronto 10-man squad at the start of the CDL. Rencor, I mean, he interviewed in English. It wasn't, like fluent or that, 100% perfect English because it's not his first language. But, I just think it's possible for some of these Miami guys to be picked up by another team if another team really wanted to. I just think Real would be the one player who other teams would try to get, and I just don't know if I feel like Miami would have to be blown away by an offer to want to move on from Real or Rencor at this point. I think, again, we'll talk more about Miami. I think if Miami makes a team, they bring Super into the roster for either Lucky or Metals. I would probably say Lucky, and they try and make something work from that perspective. But if Real and I'm not going to say OpTic, but just for lack of a better example, if OpTic makes Miami an offer they can't refuse to get Real, like maybe that's one of those dominoes that falls. I don't think that's what happens. Um, but I do think that that's like just one caveat to the roster mania stuff. Like the Vegas guys, I don't think it's possible for them to really get on one of these other teams, but I do think it's a little more potentially an option for some of the Miami guys. And the way you broke down too, we'll talk more about Carolina. I would say Carolina is the only team like FaZe, Thieves, Toronto, and Vancouver. I don't think they make a move, especially Toronto now with their strong performance in the losers bracket this event. Carolina, though, a lot of people talking about Gwyn not playing like he does on LAN when he does online. I don't think that necessarily necessitates a roster change for him. Definitely not. I think this weekend Brian Stats tweeted he passed 0 for the most wins in Ravens history. So he's like the winningest player in franchise history. So that'd be, it's like the Patriots getting rid of Tom Brady at that point, right?
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
Kidding aside, I do think Carolina didn't have the performance overall at this event that they probably would have liked. Just comparing to top 4 placing at Major 1, and they lose. They have a 3-6 map count. They lose 6 maps to Vancouver and LAT, and their 3 wins are against Vegas. So you could argue they, only won against potentially the worst team in CDL history, and then got swept by 2 other teams that are in the top of the standings. So maybe Carolina looks at making a roster change, but again, we've had this conversation at the start of these qualifiers, and then they went on a winning streak in the qualifiers after I brought that up. So I don't know what Carolina would do, but that's what I think with roster mania, like you said, I think Atlanta, Toronto, Thieves, Vancouver don't make a change or just absolutely won't make a change. Vegas will make a change because Dahum stepped down from the team, so it's unclear. They'll probably bring somebody up from the academy. But other than that, I think realistically the other 7 teams in the league could make a change. I just don't know which ones will or will stand pat.
Yeah, so I would like if I'm OpTic, I'm at least sniffing around Real just to see what's going on. Like, is he? And I think it's one thing to be like, hey, I'm comfortable. I'm with these guys that speak my language. I'm comfortable in this like team culture versus, hey, like I have a chance to go to OpTic. That's like that. OpTic is like a lot of players. It's kind of their end goal because it not only means like you can compete for championships theoretically, but you could be a bigger star than you could ever be on any other team. You can make more money, not even just getting paid by OpTic, but the YouTube and the Twitch stuff. Like even Skyz, Skyz went live for his first stream after joining OpTic. He had like 3,000 people watching his stream. And like Skyz has always been entertaining. He's always had this personality, but he's not seen nearly as much if he's on he's on Cloud9 or he's on LAG. But when he's on OpTic, there are eyeballs on him instantly. So maybe that is something that could play into that. But yeah, I think if OpTic is going to make a change, it would make sense to sniff around for Real because he is on a team that isn't competing. And like the only thing I will say about that though is it's similar but not exactly the same as the the Seattle Surge and Pred, because the Surge had a chance to win a championship that year. They had championship aspirations, and they had shown that they could at least be competitive for a championship. There has been no indication, regardless of how well they placed at Major 1, there's been no indication that the Miami Heretics are anywhere close to being a championship team. And I can understand if Miami is like, we want to build around Real because he's our Spanish guy. He is by far the best Spanish player. There's no reason to get rid of him. It'd be like if Vegas had like a really great Saudi player like Kicks. We haven't really got to see him very much, but we're not going to get rid of him because he's kind of our guy. I could understand that. But you also have to think this could be financially beneficial to us. We could, have OpTic buy him out, and then we can make that move, even if it doesn't make sense for our team's potential, or we might not make champs because of it. I don't know what the goals are for Miami, because obviously they're not competing for championships. So maybe that is something to keep in mind if OpTic or any other team wants to have Real on their roster.
I would say any other team there too, because I don't want to speak for the Spanish community, because I just know at the end of the day, I have sung Real's praises, especially since the end of last year. So I don't know. I'm not going to call myself Real's number one fan or anything like that, because there are probably some people out there who appreciate him even more than I do. But if in a world where this is even like an opportunity that's entertained of Real going to OpTic, again, looking at the roster construction, assuming Shotzi and Dashi aren't going anywhere, Real is replacing Pred in this made-up scenario. And I've sung Real's praises. I think he's a really good player. I don't think he's better than Pred. And that's just the move wouldn't make sense in that sense to me. So I think, it wasn't a great example on my part saying it, but like from a financial standpoint, or the standpoint of making a splash in roster mania, that the example stands of like Real being a player who is capable of moving off of Miami, just because we saw him, a year ago potentially being on a team. If visa issues didn't work out, he would have been with Clay and Fellow and TJ, I think, because I think he replaced. No, he played with GodRx. TJ replaced Real, I think, with the visa issues.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't see OpTic Real happening unless they. I just don't see it happening, because, like I said, he would have to replace Pred, it feels like, and that's, in my eyes, it's not an upgrade unless there's just like unsalvageable chemistry issues with Pred and Shotzi and Dashi. I don't know, but that's just one example. You don't have to overthink it. I'm already overthinking it, and hopefully there's going to be some talks over the next couple days for multiple teams, and the roster mania stuff's always fun to workshop, even in situations that we bring up here that most likely won't ever happen.
Yeah, and I think like OpTic is one of those teams where the roles aren't always the most important. They tend to prioritize talent over like how well they might fit in a specific role, because obviously roles change, and if you're trying to build a roster, yes, you're trying to build it for this season, but you're also trying to build it to like be able to change as the games change. So like I don't know. Like I was just thinking, like if you're OpTic, you could go to challengers. You could look at some of the younger players there and say like, who is the most talented here? Who can we bring up and kind of groom into being like a really talented player for years to come? Or you could do that in the CDL. You can look at players, obviously like Real, like Gwen. If you wanted to look at a player like Gio, Snoopy, these kind of players where there is talent there, like it's undeniable talent, but they haven't broke through yet. They haven't had these like breakout performances where they've landed on one of the top teams in the league. And there's probably criticism to be had about Gwen's performance this weekend, but I think he performed pretty well at Major 1. He has dipped from online to Major 1. You could say that about Carolina in some ways, is not the same team online versus Major, and they also played LAT in this in one of their only matches, and LAT is just like the worst possible matchup for Carolina, that it's kind of like unfair to even be like, well, look at your stats after that. Like, yeah, they've done that literally every single time that they've played this season. So but yeah, I think OpTic has some thinking to do, and I don't know if they'll make a change. That's my thing. I'm just not going to be surprised if they do. It's more going to be surprised of who they get, probably. Like, I guess there's a chance that Hook is lingering still out there in the ether, and he could come back, because he did not perform poorly at all. He was a very good player while he was in the CDL. I was actually looking at it this season. I know we say KD isn't everything. He has the third highest KD in the Call of Duty League this season. He has a 1.15, only behind Kix, who has played like, I don't know, 5 matches or something like that, and Celium, who's like the leading MVP candidate at this point. So if Hook were to come back, I think that would be interesting. That would be just like his third return to OpTic or something. It's just a weird situation all around. But I think we might have Rostermania news by the next time we have a podcast, which would be nice. It's always nice when we get it before the podcast and not after, as it has always been. Do you want to talk about any of this other stuff before we get out of here? Because we're about an hour and 20 minutes into the podcast.
I just think the best segue that we got right now, at least in terms of while we're on Rostermania, is just giving a shout out to the team that won the Challenger segment of this major tournament, which consisted of Arcity's Brack, Johnny, and Standy, which conveniently are 4 players who have all been in the CDL at certain points. Obviously, Arcity's more so than the others, but it's, it's very possible that those are some of the guys who are looked at by some of these teams. And it's not like quite the same as a team like taking a chance on someone like Lunars, who had never been in the CDL previously. Also, Bance was on the team that came in second place with Harry. I believe Harry was Harry one of the guys not in the London Royal Ravens?
He was at least a substitute, I think.
No, okay, maybe that's it. He was a substitute, but regardless, that was a Bance getting second in a Challengers event. Obviously, Bance, before Hydra comes along, Bance is undoubtedly the most successful European player in the CDL era, or just in modern, whatever you want to phrase it. And I think Hydra has past that with the World Championship now. But regardless, it's nice to see Bance still competing and still doing well in Challengers. And then one of the other teams in top 6 place was Katana Gaming with Brezzy and Cobra. There's also Vortex, who's I think one of those former Epsilon guys on that historic team that we bring up here and there. But most notably, I don't see Fellow in the top 8. Yeah, so Fellow's team got top 12 at this event. So, maybe that affects potentially Fellow getting a chance in the CDL, but I do think that would be one change. Not going to jump too far ahead here, but I think Minnesota needs to make a roster change. I think the easy answer for Minnesota is replacing Paul X. Just Paul X really has struggled recently individually, and even this season he hasn't posted the best numbers, but he seemed to bring some sort of leadership to a team with rather young players. So I think one move that makes sense to me, regardless of the Challengers placing this weekend, would be Fellow coming in for Paul X. But if you want to look specifically at this, the team that won the Challengers event, I mean, even Arcity's going into that team, that would definitely bring some leadership, or a guy like Brack would definitely be would add some more slaying from the AR role than Paul X, in my opinion. But I don't know how that would make sense for Minnesota from like a, in-game leader standpoint. So some interesting options for them. I just wanted to say that in case anything happens with Minnesota before we go live again. But shout out to that team that won the Challengers event. It's good for the Challengers. It is interesting. It's a team of, quote unquote veterans and all guys with CDL experience, but that is the way of the road right now in this structure where, there's only 12 CDL teams. Obviously, guys who aren't in the CDL but have been before are still going to be doing well in the the step below league if they're not at the top.
Yeah. Standings as we see them now post Major 2, more than halfway into the season. First place, no surprise, Atlanta FaZe with 330 points. 60 points behind them is LA Thieves in second. Then they have a 60-point lead on third place Toronto Ultra. And then Carolina's in fourth, right ahead of the Vancouver Surge. There's a 75-point gap between Vancouver and sixth place OpTic, who is tied in sixth with the Boston Breach. Those two teams are ahead by 10 points of the Miami Heretics. So if that was to end, the season was to end today, those would be your champs teams, those 8 teams. Right now, ninth place, Cloud9. They're only 5 points behind Miami. Minnesota's only 10 points behind Miami. They are in 10th. LAG obviously have a lot of work to do. They only have 30 CDL points this season. They are in 11th. And of course, the Vegas Falcons have 0 CDL points. They are 0-18 now, 9-54 in map count on the year. And they're not technically eliminated from champs contention, but they are realistically eliminated from champs contention. We probably won't be talking a lot about them as we get down to the end of the year, unless they keep losing, and then that is reason to keep talking about them, I guess. But yeah, that's where the standings are now. The Pick'em after this major, you were 96-46. You went 12-6 at Major 2, and I am 90-52, and I was 13-5 at Major 2. And yeah, so
both
made a
went
little bit of
undefeated
ground.
on Saturday.
What was that?
We both went undefeated 5-0 on Saturday.
Yeah.
Pretty chalky day, but pat ourselves on the back for that at least.
Yeah, I guess. And yeah, Thursday was not a great day because there were quite a few upsets. But that's how it goes. We will be back on Wednesday, probably a later pod if I had to guess. But we'll, obviously if you want to follow the podcast feed, if you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow the Twitch channel, you can figure out when we're going live, when the podcast is getting uploaded and going into your feeds. More on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, like I said, YouTube. You can look up Ego Chall Podcast on YouTube. You can also look us up on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/jbink with 2 Ks. That's JBINKK. That's the same as the Twitter. I think are you over 70 days live streaming?
Tomorrow will be day 25.
Yeah, so well over 2 months straight of streaming, so go follow him on Twitch. Like I said, you can follow Bink on Twitter. You can follow me at Preston Byers. The podcast is at Ego Chall Podcast. And we'll be back in the middle of the week to talk about some more teams in the fallout of Major 2, possibly some roster changes, some probably news and notes that we didn't get to in this pod as well. But we'll see you then. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys for all the support. As always, hope you enjoyed the major as much as I did this weekend. It was definitely a exciting one that's given us a lot to talk about in this episode, and it will be what we're talking about for the next couple episodes too, plus a sprinkle of any other news and roster mania stuff, like Preston said, as it happens. So stick with us, and like we said, over an hour ago, basically at this point we're technically at the halfway point of the season. Feels like the season's flying by, and it's now or never for a lot of these teams. So I'm expecting some changes. So is Preston. Hopefully we'll be able to have some more stuff to talk about over the next couple episodes in that regard. But even if we don't, we still have 8 teams to break down their major 2 performance. So should be some good stuff coming your way. Hope you enjoy it. If you got any feedback or anything, as always, let us know. But till then, remember to send the chow.